All right. And we are live. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Rachel, and I'm with the OpenJS Foundation. And today I'm really excited about the panel that we have lined up today. So back in 2019, before everything changed, we held this panel in Montreal at our global event. And we talked all about JavaScript trends and what 2020 had to offer. At that time, nobody knew what was in store for us. And so we thought it would be interesting and fun to bring back that panel and talk about where 2020 brought us and where we hit the mark, where we missed the mark, and then also what's to come in 2021. So with that, I am going to hand it over to our moderator, Nick Nisi, who's going to introduce the panel and get things kicked off. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, you did a lot of setting the stage there, which is great, so that I don't have to, because I don't have a stage because of the pandemic. So that's why we're all meeting on Zoom like this, to reconvene this panel on tech trend or JavaScript trends in 2020. And like you said, I'm Nick Nisi, and I moderated the panel in 2019 at Node.js Interactive in Montreal. And I was joined there, and I'm joined now by Alex Williams. Alex, welcome back.
Thank you.
And also Liz Parody. Liz, welcome back as well.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, very excited to have all of you here. And last but not least, Chris Anichek. I didn't check with you beforehand.
No worries. Let's go with Chris Anizik. But yeah, great to be here. Obviously not as nice as Montreal, but we'll take it. We'll take being at home.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's the personalities, and all of the personality is here. So I think it'll still be amazing. So let's just start right off with on a happy note, a very happy note, because while 2020 was a pretty tough year for a lot of different reasons, there were a lot of positive things that happened in 2020 relating to JavaScript and the JavaScript ecosystem. So what are some of those things that happened?
Well, I always say that one of the biggest things that happened in the JavaScript ecosystem was that NPM was acquired by GitHub. That was like a very big thing, and GitHub is owned by Microsoft. I haven't seen like a huge change in NPM. Like there's not like a revolutionary thing, like they have removed or added something great. It's like, I think NPM has kept its status quo, and I think that's something really good. Like I think that benefits the ecosystem. Yeah. So that's a huge thing that happened. I would say also that there were important releases like NPM 7, Freemium or Node.js 14 was released. And not so technical stuff, but also happy stuff that happened in 2020 related to the developer world and the programming world, was that working from home has a lot of good things. Like there's bad things too, but we're going to focus on the good things, including like flexibility. There's like a lot of work-life balance. We save money, saving commuting. Like I hate commuting. That's why I've been working remotely like for 5 years, because I don't like to be in traffic. So location independence, like positive environmental impact. So there's like a lot of good things, technology and not technology, that happened in 2020. And I'm very happy that you opened the panel with this question. So we start with a happy note.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of taking a step back to the first thing that you mentioned, which was GitHub acquiring NPM. And one of the things that we kind of highlighted in the 2019 panel was the influence that Microsoft has on the JavaScript world. And so back then, they had acquired GitHub at that time. And so, pretty much all of the world's open source code lives on GitHub. And a lot, if you look at the typical JavaScript developer, they're using Microsoft's Visual Studio Code editor to write their JavaScript.
Yeah.
And just from there, they're controlling a lot of the pieces of the ecosystem. And now, if you want to install any kind of JavaScript, you're going to be using NPM. And that is now owned by GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft. So they have continued their benevolent reign of the JavaScript world. And you did mention that things have not changed too much with regard to NPM. And Chris, what do you think? Do you think that's a good thing?
I've always kind of been impressed with the new Microsoft. They've kind of definitely have changed over the years. And one of the kind of nice things that, has happened is, I do think, they've been a great steward at NPM, but they've also launched a new service called GitHub Packages, which kind of supports, not only, Node and NPM, related artifacts, but also other things. So I think, we've kind of benefited from, lots of more feature velocity on, GitHub, and just, I think, better tools for developers. And I think Microsoft's been a fairly good steward, even though like I'm forever suspicious of things. But overall, I think it's been a lot of goodness.
Definitely. Absolutely. And yeah, so there's been a lot of that. I do think that keeping the status quo with regard to NPM is very good. They did release NPM 7, which had some changes. Of particular note is supporting auto installing peer dependencies, and they also support yarn.lock files. And Yarn is a competitor to NPM in terms of the CLI, but it still uses NPM as the repository, if I recall. So what else happened in 2020? Alex, do you have any ideas or any thoughts about some positive notes from 2020?
Well, from our point of view, we look at it in terms of there seems to be a new resurgence and interest in web architectures overall.
Mm-hmm.
And JavaScript is a deep part of that story. And we look to advancements such as what we're seeing, for instance, in the Jamstack community is one example of that. We're seeing more interest in web components overall. So we're seeing an interest in, there's a new project, for instance, from Google called the Polymer Project that's reflective of that. And I think we can't ignore projects such as Deno, and as well the continued interest in TypeScript. And TypeScript, we were all commenting on its very interesting rise in the RedMonk rankings. And James Governor said perhaps we'll see the day when we'll see a 1-2, JavaScript 1 and TypeScript 2. But in the meantime, TypeScript has just jumped way up. Vulnerabilities are still, I think that real concern that people have about thinking more about their API endpoints and how do you protect those? Because I think a lot of people might have just said, well, APIs are awesome, but didn't really think about as much how they're exposed. And I think that relates to a lot of the issues that we see in the JavaScript community. I think there was a 0-day bug that was announced by Google in Chrome, as I understand. I'd have to look it up, but yeah, Google Chrome 0-day has afflicts Windows and Mac users. That's one headline I see. So that's kind of a roundup of my thoughts.
Yeah, and that's a good tie into our next topic, which is security, and that is something that you were saying in 2019 would be an existential crisis for the JavaScript community, or will continue to be. And you just highlighted a bunch of areas where that definitely is still true, and there are a lot of that. But as I think back to 2020 and what happened in there, I can't really recall anything major beyond some of those like typical browser 0 days. I think a lot of it probably got drowned out by things like the SolarWinds attack, which wasn't really JavaScript's fault, thankfully. Right. But what other things have we seen in regards to security and the JavaScript community in 2020?
Well, I would have to ask, Chris, for instance, if he's seen anything reflected in the work that he's seen being done. I mean, it seems like JavaScript has just not been as much of a news item generally in this year, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's just an example of that boring state that I think we talked about in 2019.
It's interesting where, I'm while you're speaking, I'm trying to Google around because, at least in, cloud native land, there seems to be, security incidents pop up, people like crypto jacking or crypto miner things. I would be surprised if the JavaScript community wasn't kind of hit by folks trying to somehow mine or do something illicit potentially with crypto. I mean, we've done some research at the Linux Foundation that we published a little bit late last year about kind of the problem of, what are truly the most widely used packages, in different open source, programming language communities, right? Not only, Java and, Go, but, JavaScript. And, JavaScript was highlighted where, if I recall, there was, you could always look at like downloads as a metric, right? But that's not necessarily telling you the full story behind the scenes of potentially of packages being used by companies. And, we actually partnered with a couple SCA vendors out there to kind of get some data, from them to kind of expose, what's actually being used behind the firewall. And, I kind of remember some of the JavaScript, JavaScript's a very kind of unique community where people like create like, I don't know, like is array package. It's like a one-liner and you're just like, cool, like, it sounds super useful. But there's a lot of packages. I think in particular it was like Minimist and maybe Lodash. There was a couple of them that, was what like top 10 most widely used. And then you look at it and it's like, they haven't had a release in over a year. Does that mean they're super stable or no one's paying attention anymore? And this is not good, right? No one's responding to any security issues. So I think, we highlighted a lot of those, issues in that report, at least in the JavaScript community, where there's a lot of widely used packages that seem to work, but they're not really actively maintained.
Yeah. A lot of that could come down to how do you maintain a one-line package? It may not change too much.
There's a security issue, maybe, occasionally.
Yeah.
I think, so Chris mentioned, I think most of the vulnerabilities are in NPM and the packages, but I would like to talk about not only JavaScript, but the security programming world in general. I was reading a risk-based security magazine, and it was saying that the number of records of data exposed in 2020, like in general, the data exposed was 36 billion in 2020. So it's like 36 billion is such a huge number. To compare it, like there's 8 billion people in the world, so it's like a lot of security breaches everywhere, and it was actually called the worst year on record. So 2020 apparently had like a lot of major security breaches in the programming world. And if I can think of, I remember the biggest attack, and this was very incredible, was the attack on Twitter. I don't know if you remember that all. But it was basically 3 teenagers that attacked most of the famous people on the planet, like Elon Musk, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Kim Kardashian, like all the Twitter accounts, and they were like scamming people for Bitcoin. And it was just crazy to see that. And also, I'm sure I'm mentioning this because I'm sure Twitter uses JavaScript somehow. But this attack was not like was like a social attack. I don't know, because they were just these 3 teenagers just asked employees for Twitter, like, hey, can you give me access to this? And they gave them access. So that was more like a social intelligence attack than, so that was like fun to see. Like, I mean, it was not fun. It was like,
No, it was really a good reminder that it doesn't matter really what programming language or stack you're using. People are always going to be the weakest link in the security chain. And so you really have to train that aspect of your organization as well.
And I think it's always, and it's always advisable to, there's like 2 things, to the 2 components on security. One is to have like prevention, like for example, always use 2-factor authentications for everything, for most of the thing. And the second part would be to have the detection capabilities to rapidly react, like to press the red button. If there is an attack on your software or in JavaScript or in your application, like to rapidly shut that down or try to fix it or whatever, like it makes a big difference. So I think security is composed by those 2 parts, prevention and rapidly like reaction of possible attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. And one kind of major piece, kind of bringing it back to to maybe more JavaScript/npm specific issues was one thing that we were seeing a lot in 2020 is kind of supply chain hacks or supply chain attacks, where you can kind of squat on a package name or an organization name in npm that looks like maybe something that's extremely popular, maybe a very popular company, and then publish a lot of malicious packages to that. And the problem is that I think it kind of goes to npm being so like if you look at your dependency tree for any small project, even the dependency tree is not something that you're just going to quickly have a glance at and make sure everything's okay. It's very, very deep sometimes, and there's a lot of packages that you just have no idea why they're there or what brought them in, but they're there. And so there was some research where researchers actually created some official looking packages, published some malicious code that quote unquote malicious, that just reached out to their DNS servers and hit them saying, yeah, we were installed somewhere. And they got a lot of hits on that because it's something that you don't think of too much, and you don't if you don't really take the time to analyze, it can really sneak in there and wreak havoc on your system or on your application or your users, which is very scary. Turning the conversation just a little bit, let's turn back to another topic that we discussed in 2019, and that was diversity and inclusion. So we talked about this a lot on stage at the conference, and kind of the bottom line that we left with there was that there's been a lot of good progress, but we still have a long way to go as a community to make things more inclusive for everyone. And this might be a little bit tougher to talk about, given that we've all just kind of been, sitting in our basements for the last year. But what, if anything, have you seen as changing it to or progressing towards that goal of a more diverse and inclusive culture in JavaScript in 2020?
I would just say that, I don't think it's any surprise that, there really hasn't been much change. And I think it's actually been worse for women and underrepresented minorities, especially women. And, Liz and others can speak to this, but, a lot of women have kids, and they have to take care of their kids when they're at home. And that can be, that's a responsibility they always have, historically. And I don't think it's changed. I think one of the things that I'm looking for I'm looking for resilience, really, is what that's what I'm always looking for these days. Like, who has resilience, and what is resilience? And I see a lot of resilience in the communities of women who are developers. And I so appreciate that. And it just shows how hard they have to work just to get, just to stay even. So much harder than I have to work. And, and I just so respect, that aspect of the community where, I cover Kubernetes, I've covered the Kubernetes community, quite a bit. And that's what I see there. I see there, a real tight knit group of women who are actually, without doubt, leaders there. And that's what I just hope to continue to see in the JavaScript community is maybe women don't have the numbers, but they certainly show what community is all about. And, and their leadership is critical.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. I think in 2019, we were like in a positive note. It was like, yeah, there is a lot of work to be done, but we're working on this. There's company working on this. There's like a lot of communities working on this. So maybe in 2020 we'll improve. But then nobody could predict 2020. So I think it actually, unfortunately, has gotten worse. The inclusion and diversity in general. Because also, but what Alex mentioned, like women take care of the kids, and not only that, like finding jobs and in general, like for women is like a little bit harder. Also for people like underrepresented minorities, Black people, trans people, like is super hard. And it's not only the pandemic, it's also like a change in culture. Like there is a big cultural stuff underneath that it needs to be addressed. I was reading an an article before years ago about the United Nations in the women. If the women gets paid more or equal the men, like there was some studies that they were saying that the world in general would be better because women knows how to invest better, maybe in education or in things for the kids or in things that can make society a little bit better. So at the end, inclusion is super important to have a better world. Like I mentioned in 2019 that people that are creating software and technology in general are creating the future, and we want a future that is inclusive. So unfortunately, the pandemic and 2020, I think it didn't help at all for the inclusion. Let's hope why it turns out in 2021. I think, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm sure companies and communities can help.
The 2020 was a crazy year, overall. I think one silver lining is I do think the emphasis of virtual events have at least made it a little bit more inclusive for people to attend all over the world, geographically, which historically not everyone could go fly to Montreal, for the OpenJS event. And I think one to end maybe with a little bit more positive note is, I think in the future, almost all events will kind of have like a virtual or hybrid type model. So I think in the future, hopefully that makes things a little bit more inclusive for people, to attend all over, regardless of all the systemic issues that are in society about, women and others that kind of face issues. So I mean, maybe that's a silver lining, at least for us. We've seen our attendance from countries and other geographies that typically never attend a KubeCon show up at an event. And hopefully that's been at least a similar case in OpenJS. Plan. But I think everyone's just been distracted the last year or so. Investments. I mean, one small thing that we did, at least in CNCF, is there's kind of a saying, like, if you don't measure it, you're like, how are you going to potentially change things, right? So we've started to publish in our annual reports, at least, the kind of diversity makeup of our staff, of the technical leadership, and so on. So at least it throws out a benchmark to kind of look at to see how we could kind of gauge and improve ourselves over time. And we historically haven't done that, at least within our community. I know the JS community tends to be a little bit more progressive on that front, but just an idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in general, like companies and individuals are more aware of diversity. Like people are they're more conscious about it. But there's it's still a lot of work to be done. But for example, it was a good thing to see that a lot of companies and a lot of projects were renaming the main branch from master to main. And there's small changes in languages to be more inclusive that it helps a little bit. So you start with the little steps and then it creates snowball, and now so there's also good things. I'm not saying that it was so horrible for diversity, but it's still a lot of room for improvements. Like last year, I asked how many women were in the room, and there were 5 or 6 women. Yeah. It was hundreds of people. So, and it's always like that. And people of color or minorities, there's always very little. So yeah, I hope this changes somewhere near in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of relating to conferences, I do think that one good thing that comes out of the year that we've had is, conferences have gone remote, so we can have more people joining, and usually they're, cheaper or maybe free, depending on the conference. So it's much more approachable. The same thing with meetups. So meetups have gone online, and as an example, I attended a Vim meetup from Berlin, and I was just like everyone else because everybody else was just remote. I wasn't just kind of, the guy on the TV over in the corner. I felt like I was there and present with everyone. So that's really cool, being able to kind of have everyone on an equal footing remotely joining and learning together. And that also, we've had this rush towards remote work and remote life, and that may be sticking around beyond the pandemic, which is a good thing, because I do think it opens up the ability for a more diverse hiring pool. So you can hire from geographically diverse places as well. And it really lets you find the talent that you want and need that maybe isn't willing to relocate to the Bay Area. So that's good. So yeah, I think that those are all great things that happened from this. But I think kind of the big takeaway was there was, maybe some baby steps with that. And it's not every lifetime, I guess, that we get some kind of life-changing event that affects everyone. And the biggest takeaway from that is it doesn't affect everyone the same. Everyone's going through it, but it did disproportionately affect women and people of color, minorities in different ways. And so it is, that's something to be mindful of as we go into 2021 and hopefully a post-pandemic world. We'll see about that. So moving on to our next topic, let's talk about the low code or no code movement. And do you think that this is a response to the complexity of the web today? Alex, you want to take the first shot at that?
Oh, definitely. And, as we see over time with JavaScript, it had some early evolution, and it's been pretty much straight across the board in terms of its dominance for the past several years, but it hasn't changed the complexity for how to use it. And now with the browser being such a critical part of any web application, really, you're starting to see just a deeper level of complexity that's required. I don't know a lot about WebAssembly, but I'm curious on how that's going to affect the landscape over time. And then also when you're also thinking about TypeScript, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. And so that adds another level of complexity that you need to think about. So there's no doubt that the no-code movement has muscle, but it doesn't seem to have the muscle that really you need for the complexities that we see in the architectures that developers are building.
So in low code, I had one experience that really impacted me. So basically, low code is like, if I was reading, and it says that it's basically a visual way to code, and it's very friendly for beginners and for kids and all that. And I want to share experience. I met at the last JSConf Colombia we did like a couple of years ago. There was a kid, like he was 12 years old, and he was coding in front of 500 people in Scratch. There was like this, it's very popular, like this game Scratch. And then when you just move blocks and you start creating like code, and I think it was fantastic to see kids. And also in Montreal in 2019, we see this little girl like Ellie,
Mm-hmm.
and she was also coding with robots. And I think low code definitely, it helps a lot, like beginners. It helps a lot of kids because it makes it fun, it makes it entertaining. I can weigh my niece to be 8 years old to show her this and to put her like, I think it's actually great. And I think it definitely, in my opinion, is definitely for complexity. It helps to solve the complexity of software, because software can be very complex. So if I'm like a little girl, a little boy that wants to learn programming, and I see like code straight away, it's like, what is this? But if I see colors and numbers and maybe games and trees and little things all over, I think that would definitely be more fun. It's easier. And I have seen web pages and things built with low code. So I think it's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it really helps businesses or users get ideas from just an idea into, maybe at this time, like a simple prototype or a simple MVP of what they actually want to do. And it's a really easy way to do that without having to learn a lot of code. And from just a learning standpoint, like you said, for kids, without getting into the semantics and getting bogged down in all of like the logic of how a program is structured, if statements, all these blocks, scoping, things like that. It just lets you focus on thinking logically. And if this happens, then this should happen. Otherwise, this should happen. And kind of going through that flow, it's a really easy way to learn the mentality behind coding without really diving into complex code. And then that can translate into JavaScript, Perl, like any language, and go
Yeah,
from
if you
there.
know the fundamentals, like the fundamentals, and
Mhm.
that's the fundamentals, like if a statement or whatever, that if you learn the basics later, like it would be so much easier to code. So I really like low code.
Absolutely.
That's
And
great.
And from a low code standpoint, like having a little bit of code, another piece that might be kind of taking the world by storm is the Jamstack, which might be
Yes.
kind of low back end code for front end developers. Chris, what are your thoughts on Jamstack? Is it a thing?
I mean, like from a personal usage perspective, like, we use a lot of Netlify. I personally use a lot of Netlify, but I haven't kind of, explored other aspects of kind of the Jamstack to kind of truly make it useful to maybe like replace an existing, application. I don't know, like an old blog or something, and with the Jamstack equivalent and so on. So, I mean, I think it is a thing. We are seeing kind of a bit of usage within our kind of cloud native ecosystem, but it's still very like nascent from my perspective. I do think there's a lot of potential. Basically, any technology that simplifies the developer experience, makes it easier to use and be productive, I think is gonna do well, especially if you're not like required to learn a new type of programming language and developer experience is nailed. And I think that's what Jamstack is trying to do by taking advantage of the huge JavaScript ecosystem, by also trying to offer kind of a unique kind of serverless type offering for developers, so they don't kind of have to deal with all the stuff. But definitely a lot of innovation. You're seeing a lot of companies doing Jamstack offerings. I think just this week, like Cloudflare announced like their Pages thing is like out of beta now, which is kind of a Jamstack based offering. Netlify continues to grow. I think you'll see more and more clouds offer Jamstack style solutions, which will in turn increase adoption. But I think the Jamstack is focused on the right aspect of making it easy, like making it easier for developers to actually be, effective, and so on.
Jamstack is getting a lot of attention from us in our coverage of the space. Richard McManus has been writing a lot about Jamstack. And there's been some interesting stories about, what Jamstack represents. And Matt Billman, who's one of the founders of Netlify, calls basically the browser a new runtime, really. And for him, I think he definitely has a vested interest in it, but I think that says a lot about kind of just the power of the browser and the role that JavaScript plays in that. You can really begin enhancing the user experience, that have increasingly been capable through JavaScript engines, like open source V8 from Google. Matt talks about that. And there's so many powerful browser APIs to enable services. And, you can do local caching, location services, identity services. There's so much you can do. And so I can't see why, Jamstack would slow down at all, especially with the serverless, story to start unfold from there. But that's going to bring the complexity somewhere. I mean, I think that's the big question. Where does that complexity go? And, and that's the question I think, is one to ask, what does that do for actually the overall complexity itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it kind of builds layers on top of that complexity. So it makes things more approachable to me as a self-proclaimed front-end developer. I can really take charge of an entire stack by not needing to learn how to properly configure a web server and a database. And all of that stuff, it can all just be wrapped up into an AWS-like offering, and then I can just learn how to work within their stack. And then that is itself super complex. So then I can work on a layer on top of that with Netlify functions and things like that, where it's just exposing in a simpler way the things that I want. And so I can build more of the application by myself and have a better understanding of it and an easier way to talk about and to share that with others without having to worry about all of the minutia of actually getting it running. It's just allowing me to focus on my business goals or my product goals and get it there without all of that, which is really pretty cool. So I do like that part of the no code or low code movement, as we say. And it does seem like, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, it does seem like we are seeing a lot of that. We've mentioned Netlify as being a big Jamstack, big in the Jamstack space. There's also, like Gatsby, which is like a more full-fledged solution for developing like an application, a web application in like a fully enclosed environment. And then we have other ones like Vercel, which is, it provides the backend and the tooling that you need for that serverless component, but then it has specialized tooling like Next that allows you to develop with like server-side rendering and things like that. So it really takes advantage of the prescribed stack that they have and allows you to do more with that right off the bat.
Yeah, I think Jamstack is great because of several reasons. It provides like a better developer experience, performance, security, especially lower cost and greater scalability.
Yeah.
And it's successful because of two terms, basically. One is pre-rendering, which means that everything is already rendered. So when a user make a request, it doesn't have to go to a database and get an answer. So because sites can be just served directly from Obsidian. So it's super fast and cheap. But and as you said, there's a lot of great tools like Gatsby, Netlify, Next.js that are using Jamstack. And so I think it's going to definitely be increasing. But at the same time, it's important to take into account that Jamstack has a few problems because sites are great as long as they're built with text and images, specifically because Jamstack is for static content because everything is pre-rendered, right? So, but as soon as your site requires like dynamic features, it gets potentially a little bit more difficult. It has like more problems. Another problem is that if you want to update content or small changes, it has to be by coding and it has to pre-render the whole site again. And another problem I found is like it relies heavily on third parties and also APIs. So for example, if your API on a third party goes down, your site will probably go down as well. So at the end, Jamstack has a lot of great things, but it also has its not so good things. So as always, it depends on what you need. So if you need like a static site with a lot of text, images, for example, a big e-commerce blog post or Node.dev, which is a site we created in Node source for Node.js news. So Jamstack is absolutely great. But if you need like a huge application with a lot of dynamic content, very complex architecture, you might need something else. So for me, it always depends. Like I think it's increasing and it has a lot of value, but yeah, it also has like not good things that people maybe need something else.
There was a little bit of a turf war at the end of last year between Matt Billman and Matt Mullenweg, Jamstack compared to WordPress. And Matt's point is that, WordPress now taps into many of the same front-end technologies that Jamstack does, that has a REST API that Matt says is awesome, a GraphQL API, and you can use it decoupled. There are things like he talks about Frontity that allows you to build WordPress with serverless pre-rendered using React. There's just a lot of ways to do integrations, and so yeah, I mean the big issue I've had. I mean, I fell in love with these static platforms several years ago when I was considering what to use for our content management system. And I'm like, I think I would spend like 95% of my time teaching people how to use an editor, with a static site, and so it just was like, just not doable. So for developers, I think it's fine. It goes back to that, no code part of the world, probably where I'd more fit in. But, I mean, I think there's a lot, it just kind of shows almost like the similarities, but real kind of like complexities that come when you're trying to choose between these platforms. I mean, for developers, I think, Jamstack's great. I just don't know about for everyone else.
Yeah. And I do think that that friendly, I'll call it a fight, but the friendly fight between the Mats and WordPress versus the Jamstack, I do think that lends a lot of goodwill and goodwill to the ideas of the Jamstack, because there are a lot of those features being built into WordPress, which does power like 30% of the internet or something like that. And giving them a road to get to those Jamstack ideas while still staying, within the comfortable WordPress platform and the CMS that they're used to is really powerful and really speaks a lot to the ideas that is a focus for that community. So kind of to change topics a little bit, I wanted to get to one more question before we kind of wrap up here. And that's just talking about JavaScript itself. So JavaScript is, it's continuing to lead. I think we have a slide to show with some language stats. And that shows that for the past several years, JavaScript has just been the #1 language. And that's why we're here talking about it. It's obviously a language that we really like. And it's something that really, no matter what language or what kind of developer you claim to be, if your product or your app touches the internet or the web in any way, you probably have JavaScript in there too. So it's just kind of an add-on to every other language, which is pretty cool. But do we see that trend continuing? Do we see anything shaking this line going into 2021 and beyond?
Well, I think we should give Redmond credit. They've been doing this since 2012, and they've been citing TypeScript, and that's, to me, the most interesting aspect of this data here. I mean, look at that TypeScript line. I mean,
Yeah.
look at that ascent. I mean, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up.
Yeah.
And I think it did reach into the top 10 this year, and it surpassed Ruby.
Yeah, it's number 8. JavaScript is number 1, meaning I don't know how to do math, but that would make JavaScript number 18. It's in the first and 8th spot because TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript. So it's extremely cool seeing that.
And I think there's some other things to look at. I mean, Java dropped, and that gave Python has given the Python the opportunity to rise up to the top there. And Python is, I think we were talking about in another call how Python is perceived as a little bit easier to use than JavaScript. So I think that's something to look at, is like, and now, I think there was a question from the crowd about AI and JavaScript, and Python has been reigning supreme, in the data science community. And so, that's something I'd be curious to look at, is how, the JavaScript plays in this space in comparison to Python.
Yeah, and I think that does kind of speak to what might unseat JavaScript is, would it be something like a WASM compiled language or WebAssembly? Would it be something that runs in the browser? It would obviously have to be something that runs in the browser to get past JavaScript, I think, at this point. But could a WebAssembly language do that? Or would it be something like TypeScript, where it's still just, JavaScript, but it's still the JavaScript that you're familiar with, but with some additional types bolted on? And how are tools changing to grow with this environment where we have this ability to develop kind of with other languages?
Well, I think TypeScript, as we see, is obviously like growing up a lot, incredibly. Even in 2019, I said TypeScript is going to grow a lot. That was a good prediction I had, but I couldn't predict anything else. But I don't think TypeScript will replace or overcome or overrun like JavaScript. I think JavaScript will always be, for many, many years more to come, will always be the first one, for example. And I think maybe at some point, the language itself, JavaScript itself, are going to adapt some things that from TypeScript. So, for example, what happened with CoffeeScript? Like CoffeeScript used to be very popular, but then JavaScript like adapted things from CoffeeScript, and CoffeeScript died. So if that happens, like JavaScript the language itself start getting like adapting things from TypeScript, maybe TypeScript is going to die. So we don't know. Like, but I don't think TypeScript is going to be bigger than JavaScript. Sometimes, like maybe that won't happen. And yeah, I think JavaScript will be the #1 for many, many more years to come.
Yeah, definitely. I think that one thing that might be that JavaScript might be taking a hit on right now is performance. And it seems like a lot of even JavaScript tooling is being rewritten in other languages like Go and Rust because of the perceived performance increases that you get from that. Just in terms of like, bundling a site or things like that. Things like ES-Build, which is written in Go, take advantage of that speed to really accelerate development workflows. So do you think that speed of writing things in JavaScript could hinder it going forward as like an option for writing tooling?
Chris, I'm gonna be the one that throws it to you.
I mean, people are always going to rewrite, software and take advantage of anything faster, down the line. We're even seeing that within our community where the majority of stuff is in Golang. And, there's kind of this odd fascination with new and shiny things, things like Rust, Rust as a programming language that also has kind of very unique performance characteristics compared to Golang, so we're seeing it now where a lot of our tools are, people are joking, oh, we're going to rewrite this in Rust because it's a little bit faster and better to maintain. So, I mean, it'll be interesting. I think, it truly depends kind of, languages sometimes have their own unique niches and so on. It's very rare to kind of see something like that's truly maybe general purpose. I think, to Alex's point, Python seems to have carved out a niche for very beginner friendly and also kind of dominates the kind of data science, AI, ML side of the house. JavaScript, obviously front end, but also a little bit of back end with Node and so on. But, on the back end, sometimes people look at other things, right? Like Rust and Go. So I think, over time, like people are going to use all multiple things. And, I think it's truly going to depend on how easy, the language is for its kind of general purpose and wide usage overall. So
yeah,
don't know if that really answers the question too much, but like, what are kids like first programming language, right? Like, is it JavaScript these days? No, I think mostly Python is probably where a lot of folks start out, at least at university.
I think they're going to start right up with a WebAssembly compiled language because it'll just be so simple. I think that it's cool that all of this exists because it gives us these like a way to do straightforward JavaScript in a way that handles, most of your use cases. But then when you need a lot of power or a lot of, or a different way of organizing and thinking about things, you can write in a Rust compiled language, a WASM compiled language, and really have more of like an application level workflow in the browser. I'm thinking of things like Figma, which is I think compiled from WASM and really feels like a desktop application that's running in your browser. And it's just really cool that you have all of these options available to us, and it really grows the platform as a whole as just being this place where you can write your simple forms, you can write your simple blog posts, you can write full-on video games, and you can write your design tools all in it, which is just really cool to have one platform that can handle it all.
Well, like what was the joke in Spinal Tap? Our AMP goes to 11. We have that little bit extra right there.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch because, I think, if you kind of look at the trends here is, I think, JavaScript obviously is a popular language, but was it popular because of it was just a very easy language to learn and use, or was it because the browser was basically everywhere and kind of became like a new virtual machine that used? And so like, or, you look at TypeScript, I'm like, maybe people really want types, and that's what's going on here. But I think maybe over time JavaScript, as a language maybe is less widely used, but the browser runtime that takes advantage of WASM essentially running inside of like V8 or any of the different WebAssembly runtimes will have that equivalent deployment model where wherever the browser runs, WebAssembly is going to run, and you could basically use any programming language.
It really is a happy little accident that we're here talking about JavaScript right now rather than talking about how cool our Java applets are. That's a happy accident for sure. Another thing that came out in 2020 or that reached 1.0 in 2020 was Deno, which is kind of a competitor to the Node runtime in a lot of ways, where it takes a different look at the security model of Node and how packages are created and consumed by within the project. It doesn't use CommonJS at all because it was created in a post CommonJS world where ECMAScript modules are part of the language. And do you see that being a competitor to the Node ecosystem?
It doesn't get a lot of attention yet, does it? I mean, Liz?
Yeah, it doesn't get a lot of attention. Like, it definitely, like, I mean, it was created by the same creator of Node, and it's like, it's funny, Node, Deno, like the same word, the same letters. But no, I thought it was going to have actually a bigger adoption, but I haven't seen that. I haven't seen like a very widely adoption of Deno. I don't know how to pronounce it, but yeah, I don't know what Chris has seen so far.
Nothing in my part of the world, at least. So
yeah.
It's not something that I've played with too much either, but it is something that I'm keeping an eye on because I do like the idea of being able to write closer to actual JavaScript rather than requiring a bundler and all of these things. And all of that is also being solved in Node, I think, with ES modules are now available in Node, and so you can write that as well, and browsers understand them. So we are getting away from this kind of we have to compile it to get the code to run anywhere, back to we can just write it and run it. And I'll still probably be writing it in TypeScript and have that compiler, but it is cool that that we're all moving forward towards these standards-based solutions, which is pretty cool. And I think that Deno and ES modules in Node really push that forward.
Definitely. I think the idea behind Deno is very good. Like, it has a very good approach, and like it seems that it was very well built. But I think one of the main problems is that Node is so popular. Like it's so hard to get over Node. Like if I have a huge project using Node, what would I change to Deno if Node's already work, right? I think the main problem with Deno is like Node is already very popular, but Deno like the infrastructure and the way Deno was built, I think is super good. It's just, Node is more popular, and I think it will always be.
Yeah. Well, all right, let's go ahead and wrap up now. And so I'll just throw to each of you real quick to give your final thoughts, maybe on what you're excited about or what you anticipate seeing as we go into 2021. So Liz, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So definitely after 2019, I think I cannot predict anything. I mean, 2020 was such a difficult year that trying to predict things, like everything can change tomorrow, like who knows, right? But I'm very excited for the post-pandemic world. To see, I'm very excited for inclusion and diversity. I'm very fan of that. And I also think TypeScript might be still growing up a little bit, React. But yeah, like now I'm scared of making predictions because who knows what's going to happen, right? Like,
oh yeah. Alex, do you want to go next?
The singularity is coming. We know it's coming. It's inevitable for that one language. I mean, with Microsoft running kind of the world, I'm being facetious a little bit here, but I think there's just a definite interesting play here that Microsoft has taken. While being very friendly in the open source community, there's a lot of history with Microsoft and how they actually do like to operate. So I'm just very curious and a little bit skeptical, and I think that'll give rise to these competing capabilities. And one of the kind of interesting dynamics that I'm going to be looking at is how we think about web architectures and the standardization of web architectures over time. Again, quoting Richard, he wrote a story about web components and the Polymer project, which is interesting and kind of has a different take on, the role of web components compared to, what you see from the framework's point of view. So, I'm looking for some change, but not dramatic change. But I'll be from my point of view, it's the web architectures that will continue to shape the landscape and how we view things.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, you want to go next?
Sure. I'll be quick. Two things. I think one, we kind of alluded to this. I think WebAssembly is continuing to kind of grow as an option, especially as it matures, not only in the browser but outside the browser and other kind of WASM runtimes environment. The WASI spec is evolving, so things are being supported to kind of meet those needs for folks that are running out of the browser. So that's, to me, that was a simple one. I think that's an easy prediction. I think the other thing that, given someone who's probably built, developer tools for, over half of his career, I think this kind of modern, let's call it like shared developer workspaces. So I don't know if you played with GitHub code spaces or Gitpod as example. I think that's going to kind of take over as a more common development style for folks where, if you're writing on GitHub and you go open up and get GitHub code spaces or Gitpod in one click and have everything set up, configured, people are going to use it, right? Especially new contributors. Imagine going to a repo and not having to figure out all right, how does this thing build? How do I set up? If you actually had a development environment that will be pre-built and load up VS Code in the browser on the fly and allow you to contribute with very little setup, I think it's going to change things. So whatever we're going to call it, cloud native development environments, I don't know, but that's going to be, I think, a huge thing, especially as GitHub code spaces comes out of beta this year. I think it's going to change the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, all of our tooling is going to the cloud and being written in JavaScript and running in a browser. It's really quite cool to see. And I'll just close off by saying that we've seen so many cool changes with JavaScript. It can persevere through anything, even a pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to what we do in 2021 and beyond. So I just want to thank all of you for joining me. Alex, Liz, Chris, thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So thanks for hosting. Good to see you.